Okay, thank you for joining the tour, and I dedicate this to Senior Juan Navarro, who is my teacher here. He wasn't regarded by archaeologists in Peru as being anything because he wasn't a professional archaeologist, but he studied the cultures of this area for more than 40 years and taught me a lot. So here we have this character called Merit-Aten, who was one of the daughters of Akhenaten. And when you translate her name, it means the beloved of Aten. So that's, when you get into ancient Egyptian, as in the real names of places, then you get into what these, what the real information is as compared to the interpretation by Egyptologists. Because what most people don't know, for example, is that when the Greeks entered Egypt, they came in as a dominating force. And so they went and they saw all these hieroglyphic writings and they said, what does this translate to? We want to translate to Greek. And so the priests were quietly offended by that. And so they lied about what the hieroglyphics meant. And that is what the Rosetta Stone is. It's not a proper translation.
Really?
Yeah? That's what you learn when you, when you go with the Kemet school in Egypt. They're the ones who know the actual real oral tradition knowledge as compared to archaeology, which tends to be an interpretation of stuff they find. They don't ask local people, what do you say this means? So Aten is going to become important later on in the talk. I've included Akhenaten. Are they based on sculpture, or is it sculpture? And here's Senior Juan with an 18-month-old Baracus baby. And you notice it has dark red hair. So this baby was bundled up for 2,000 years, and we were able to acquire it. And I asked Senior Juan if we could open it up, and he said, no, we can't. It's owned by the Ministry of Culture. And after 2 years, he finally let a Peruvian archaeologist open it up. And there's your red-haired child from 2,000 years ago, like genetically red hair. So in many different cultures around the world, especially about 2,000 years ago, you had this head binding that was done to the nobility of a civilization. So it wasn't everybody that was done. It was only the royalty and the other levels of nobility to physically distinguish themselves from the common people. And this is a practice that the Inca also did, which most people don't know about. So different forms of head binding, cradle boarding, etc. You take a newborn baby, and over the course of 3 years, you slowly alter the shape of the skull. And by 3 years, then the skull is solid bone. And then the person retains that shape for the rest of their life. Oops. So different cultures. On the left, you have the Ucayali people of the Amazon in Peru, still doing that until recently. And then in the middle, you have a lady from the west coast of Canada. And then on the right side, literally what is called a flathead Indian, because that's what they actually called themselves. So 3 different cultures, all the nobility altering the shape of their babies' heads in order to look different from the general public. And other different head binding forms. These are the 2 most common found in Peru, especially the vertical deformation like that, but then also some examples of this where it's almost like a dome or an M shape. That's quite rare, but that was another form. And it's believed that the different shapes correspond to different levels of the nobility. So the priestly class would have one shape, and then the chiefs would have probably a different shape. And again, that would allow the general public to be able to distinguish who was of what class of the nobility. And so here you have again what archaeologists describe as head binding. So it's more or less flattening of the front and the back of the skull. And on the far left, that's a Baracus. So you see, it's actually, the Baracus is a very complex shape or compound shape. So it's unlikely that oh, gracias. So that one on the left could be an example of someone who was born with the skull of that shape. Because again, it's all curved, but you don't see flat areas, you see curves everywhere. So in different societies around the world, again, you have the west coast of Canada, and into Oregon and Washington State. Then the Maya and the mound builders and the different Andean civilizations and the megalithic builders of Europe. In Sudan and also Egypt, theoretically. Attila the Hun had an elongated head, and then also into Melanesia as well. So many different cultures did this. Were they from a common influence or not? Nobody really knows. And this is in the back room of the Ica Museum, where you're not allowed to take pictures, but I did anyway. So you see, there are various different shapes of elongated skulls they have. They've been in these boxes since probably 1920 or something, never on display to the public. And why they won't let you take pictures is, of course, the big question. It's like, why not? And what's really interesting also is this shape here, which is called the Chicana, which is a 12-sided symbol. If you superimpose it onto Peru and Bolivia, almost all of the elongated skulls are found down that line. That's called the path of Viracocha. And then, let's see, and then here, this is the Chicana shape again. So all the megalithic structures are found along this path of Viracocha, and also at each megalithic site where there's a museum, they have elongated skulls. And as well, this direction here, this is going from two different points, going through Cochabamba, Tiahuanaco, and Baracus. And there again, those three locations, you have elongated skulls. What the relationship is to the design, I don't know, but it's just interesting that an early researcher discovered that all the megalithic sites are basically on one energetic line. So that gets into the whole thing about lost ancient technology, energetic function of the structure, etc. And the oldest culture that we know of in Peru and Bolivia area with elongated skulls is called the Chinchorro, and they were located in the northern part of Chile, the coast of Chile, and they were mummifying their dead 8,000 years ago, so 3,000 years before the Egyptians. Nobody knows where they came from, and nobody knows why they did this practice. But we'll see examples. This is a Chinchorro skull. And this is another one, the difference being this is vertical elongation, and this is more swept back, similar to what Maritaten is shown to look at. So when people try to, especially when we get later on, when people try to compare the Baracus skulls with those of Egypt, they're very different shapes, so probably not from the same influence. And then this is another very elongated skull. One important thing to look at is this bulge here, because that seems to be a characteristic of what I'll show to be likely the oldest and most natural shaped ones of probably the first Baracus looked like that. They're probably genetically had elongated skulls, and then over the course of time, because they were a small gene pool, they had to mix in with other normal looking people. And then as the generations started to pass, they started to notice the skulls were getting smaller, so that's when they likely introduced cranial deformation to maintain the design that they wanted. So we're going to follow along the path of Viracocha. This is called Cerro Tanupa, which is at the salt flats of Uyuni in Bolivia, and that's the volcano in the background. And there are many caves in the area that have slightly elongated skulls, nothing too profound, but nobility of these people had cranial deformation. Oh, and this is another example. You see the flattening of the back of the head, and then the flattening of the forehead. So that's cranial that's head binding. Then the next stop is called Cerro de Potosi, which was one of the largest silver mines in the world, and in their little museum too are examples of pretty profound cranial deformation that we see. And this is the next, still going up this line, this is called the Karani Culture. They lived between 2000 BC and 1000 BC. And we're not sure if they're related to the earlier ones or not. But again, they're all in the same geographical direction. Then we get to Tiahuanaco. And this is the famous sun gate that we're going to see. And this is where we're going to see the incredible precision of stonework. What's somewhat really interesting about the site is that you don't find many 90-degree angles. They're all either more than 90 or less than. And so that's very complex engineering to be able to do this kind of work. Conventional archaeologists say it was a Bronze Age culture that did it, but that's clearly impossible. But there, actually right next to a restaurant we're going to be having lunch, this quite massive skull was found. And so the restaurant is actually built on top of the Royal Tiahuanaco Cemetery on private property. This guy was digging a foundation for a building and he came across all these skulls and bones and things. Unfortunately, somebody stole this one because he kept it in an outside shed and thought people would go and look and just look, but somebody stole it. And so what they're doing is, these are actual elongated skulls found at Tiahuanaco that they've been doing facial reconstruction of. And unfortunately, they were on display, then they were not on display, and then they were put back on display. And we'll have to see what the status is when we go there, of whether they were on display or not. They were missing for 6 years, and every time we'd go back to visit, I'd say, why aren't they on display? And they said, oh, we're still cleaning them. So whether it's a government cover-up or what, I don't know. And next is the Island of the Sun. This is the northern end of the Island of the Sun, and remnants of megalithic stuff that has been recycled to make a little altar, for example. And that, again, is a location where you find these somewhat elongated people of nobility. And this is a really interesting one, which is at the Watahata Museum. Hopefully we'll get to see it. This is about maybe a year and a half old or 2-year-old baby, and you see the incredible elongation of that. In order to bind that and make that shape happen so quickly is unlikely, because that probably would have killed the child, because you're altering the shape of the brain as you go. So this is an example of one we'll get to see. And next are the Chulpa Towers at Silustani, which we're going to see too, and in their little museum. Again, somewhat deformed skulls, but nothing too exceptional. And this is in Arequipa. These are Chulpa Towers that contain elongated skulls. And here we have Waiki, which we're going to see. And Waiki is located in a little museum at Andahuaylas. And she is presently being DNA tested in 2 laboratories in North America. And what's really intriguing about her, which we know she was female, she died about 800 years ago to a blow to the back of the head. And she was buried in a very prominent royal cemetery. So she wasn't probably regarded as a freak, but probably as someone very special. And you can see her head is the size of her torso. So that's not simple cranial deformation. That's a genetic anomaly. And so far we've only seen one like her, but the Central Museum in Lima has a warehouse that has 10,000 Peruvian ancient skulls. But they won't let me go in because I don't have a PhD. So we don't know what they're hiding in there. But there is, on some level, a cover-up, because this is becoming somewhat famous around the world, this inquiry as to who were these ancient people, and are they actual human beings, or what were they? She also has 10 sets of ribs, which is 2 less than a normal human being. The rib cage is upside down. So we had an anatomy expert look in person, and he said the organs would be in completely different places. And also what's left of one arm is much longer than it's supposed to be, and the bones are very thin. And he said, I don't see how this could be a bipedal person, because the limbs are just too long and too frail. And so when we look at the top of the skull, we see that the fontanelle has not closed, so technically that would make Waikiki less than 2 years old, if she was a normal human being. Oops. And you see the size of the eye sockets, like quite massive and vertical. You know, they should be oval or round. So that's another genetic anomaly. And then the teeth, she has molars, and 2-year-olds don't have molars. So these are the sorts of things you look for as in comparing a normal person, someone with cranial deformation, which is a normal person who's been altered, and some other kind of phenomenon that's going on. And this was a 15-year-old that was found in the same cemetery, and this is facial reconstruction of the actual skull itself. Likely lived during the Inca time period, again around 1200 AD. And then the path of Viracocha goes straight through this structure, which we're going to see, which is called the Inti Punku, or the Sun Gate. And this is a bit of the lost ancient technology to throw in for you, because you see the size of these massive stones that perfectly fit together, made out of basalt, and then you see the kind of much cruder work on top. The work on top is the work of the Inca, on top of a megalithic structure they found. And then we see, even in the Inca times, we see depictions of maybe people with red hair, and that's what the early chroniclers in Cusco from Spain recorded. They saw these very light-skinned people, skin lighter than theirs, with red hair and blonde hair, and they inquired as to who they were. They were told, no, those are not Inca, those are the Viracochans. They came to Cusco thousands of years before we did. So that again changes all of standard Inca history, because the Incas supposedly discovered nothing when they got to Cusco except some villagers living in huts. But we're going to see Cusco was a megalithic city that was destroyed by a cataclysm of some kind. The Inca are chased out of Lake Titicaca, and they know the homeland is called the Navel. So they went back to the ancestral home of Cusco and rebuilt it. And these are some of the skulls we're going to see, which are in the basement museum of the Karani Culture. And again, you see these two are quite elongated. And what's intriguing is this is called the Parietal Suture, which everyone has. And this is the other suture. So all normal human beings have these two sutures here and there. But in this one, there's another suture coming down the forehead, which when medical professionals look at, they just scratch their head, because they say, I didn't study that in university. You know, there's another genetic anomaly. And then this one doesn't have that suture at all, so it only has one suture, and that's what we look for when we're looking for evidence of the genetically elongated skull people. And this is about a 1.5-year-old baby. So you see the quite extreme elongation, probably from the Inca time period, but has never been radiocarbon tested, so we don't know how old it is, but it's probably either Viracochen or Inca. And it's quite possible that the Viracochans genetically mixed with other people to actually develop what we call the Inca Civilization, because when we talk to local people who are Inca, of which there aren't many people, any tour guide will probably tell you that they're of Inca bloodline, but they're not, because they have to know what's, excuse me, called their Panaka, which is their genetic background. Like, what High Inca are they related to? So if somebody says, my last name is Pachacutec, then you can say, oh, okay, so you're from Pachacutec, or I'm from the Inca Roca family. It's like, oh, so Inca Roca, the 6th Inca. But if somebody says, my name is Javier Gonzalez, you know, and they can't, if they can't claim their Panaca, then they're doing that in order to make themselves special. And we're also, of course, going to hear, this is Oyente Tambo. And I'm just giving you a bit of a preview. In most of the megalithic locations, the megalithic work is at the bottom, and then the Inca work is on top. But in this case, this is where the megalithic stuff is there, on top. So the Inca found that, destroyed, again by a cataclysmic event, and they were obviously in awe of the stonework they found. So then they built Oyente Tambo as a major center because of that. We'll see the same thing at Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu as well. The core of Machu Picchu is megalithic, and the Inca found it and went, wow! And then they built the city around it. And the correct pronunciation is Machu Picchu, which means the ancient mountain. If you say Machu Picchu, that means ancient penis. Just for your...
What's that again?
Picchu or Pichu. That's why there's the little mark, the C mark C. That's because you stop. And then, so at the quarry where the giant stones of Oyente Tambo are from, you can see this, you know, this huge skull on this spot. There's some normal ones over there, and then a really big one, and then this really huge one. And so this person on the right likely was genetically of a different bloodline than the standard Native Americans of the area. And then in other little museums that we've been exploring, again, this little baby, maybe a year and a half old. And another site called Wari. So this again is a location that's at least 1,000 years old, that the Wari culture, the pre-Inca civilization had. And this is the work of the Wari civilization. You see the wall in behind, and they found these giant slabs there already, so they recycled them and built something else out of it.
So that's Huari with an H.
What's that?
Pronounce it with the spelling with an H, Huari?
Yeah, it's H-U-A-R-I.
Okay.
Yeah, some people put a W, but that's what's great about Gustavo is Gustavo's ancestry is African and Quechua. So if you give him the name of a place, he can decode it for you. So that's why he corrected me. It's actually not, he said it's not Tiahuanaco, that's the name given by the Aymara people who found the site. He said the Inca term, which would be, or the older term is Tiahuanaco. So that's the Quechua pronunciation. So it's Tiahuanaco as compared to Tiahuanaco, just like Huari compared to Wari. And so here again too, we see elongated skulls found in the area, and also examples of trepanation or brain surgery, which you see a lot of in the Baracus culture. And the standard story by archaeologists is that this kind of brain surgery was done because of warfare, like somebody gets whacked on the head, and so the surgeons have to cut part of the skull open to release the fluid that's you know, building up pressure inside the brain, or to release evil spirits. But it could have possibly been the result of complications as they were learning the process of cranial deformation that they encountered this. And others believe actually that they knew about the ancient bloodline that came first, and that these people, because they had elongated heads and very large brains, they could have been incredibly psychic. And so as the percentage of original genetics starts to decrease, normal human characteristics start to increase, then some of their mental powers might have been starting to get lower and lower. And so by doing the surgery, you could trigger the pituitary gland and also the pineal gland, which are supposed to be psychic centers. So that's another possibility. And just another museum in the area of Wadi that has these skulls. And then, now we're starting to move in the other axis, rather than the path of Viracocha. Now we're moving gradually in the direction of Baracus, and so this site is in the highlands of Peru, about 4 hours east of Baracus. And again, you can see the original megalithic construction here, and then repair work done here, and Inca work done on top of it. So the Inca never took, we don't think they ever took an ancient structure apart, because they were in awe of whoever these ancient builders were, but they would add on to it and probably change the function from whatever the original function was that could have been energetic or pragmatic to something that was a spiritual or religious center, which again is another energetic function, but not exactly the same. And here, even to this day, there's an elongated skull in one of the alcoves with people still offering gifts of fruit and water and cigarettes and stuff. So the Catholic Church wasn't able to wipe out all of the ancient belief systems. Some people still, it's starting to come out more and more, because there's more and more of a renaissance in Peru of awareness of who your ancestors were. That was suppressed for almost 500 years by the Catholics and the Spanish government and stuff. Then we get to Huaytora, which is again getting closer to Baracus, and this is where it gets very bizarre. Because you see, again, the head is the size of the torso. Yeah. So we went there recently, again, and these mummies are no longer on display, you know. And so Irene asked the director of the museum, why not? And he said, oh, in order to preserve them properly. I mean, they were in glass cases. How can you know, that's the best way to preserve something. Now they're in boxes in the basement. It could be that this has attracted too much attention. And so it's starting to break the paradigm again of standard Peruvian archaeology that discounts the idea that there could have been Homo sapiens something else living in Peru in one or more locations. This just shows you, see the size of the head and the fact that it's very complicated in terms of curvature. So this is not a simple example of head binding the front and the back of the skull to change the shape. The volume relative to the size of this little child is huge.
Where was this found at?
It's called Huaytora. It's about 3-hour drive east of Baracus, moving up into the highlands. It's on the road that goes from Baracus to Cusco, which is the original Inca road. One of the points, as I was saying earlier, that connected the coastal Inca road with the highlands Inca road, because they were interconnected in many different places. That's why you wound up with 25,000 miles of road systems. So the royal roads, the two of them are parallel, and they're called the Capac Nian, which means the royal way, or the royal road. Then we get to Baracus itself, and we're going to see these in the Ica Museum, not allowed to take photographs. And this is the most classic one. If you go on Google search engine or any other one, that's the one that usually pops up first. If you put in Nephilim skull, alien human hybrid skull, that one shows up. And what's intriguing is we recently found that the largest elongated skulls are from one cemetery called Chongos, and they're all found in a 10-hectare area. So all of the largest elongated skulls in the world are found in one specific location. And that is mysterious. So standard archaeology believes that the Baracus originally came from a site in the highlands of Peru, based on a comparison of their pottery styles. And so when I asked, Senior Guana originally was very strictly by the book archaeology, but when he told me that, I said, well, did this earlier culture at Chavin bind their skulls? And he said, no, they didn't. So I said, well, what, did the Baracus suddenly arrive on the coast and decide to do this? And he went, oh, I see what you mean. So he started to get into the stuff I was scientifically looking at because of simple anomalies like that. You have the largest elongated skulls in the world found in one location on the coast of Peru, and the culture they're supposed to have come from didn't do even cranial deformation. That doesn't make sense. It appears from what we're seeing now and what you'll see with the genetics is that the Baracus arrived on the coast of Peru from another part of the world. So when we compare this Chavin style with the Baracus style, I, being a sculptor, see no similarity whatsoever. So Julio Citeo, who was the god of Peruvian archaeology, obviously wasn't a student of art, because for him to say that culture and that culture are the same doesn't make any sense. And this is the old Baracus Museum. We're going to go to the new one, but this is where we have 45 elongated skulls on display. And so we'll get to see and do a comparison of all of them the day after tomorrow when we're there. And this is Baracus itself. So you have this is the Baracus Bay. And the Baracus culture extended from Chincha, excuse me, which is up here, all the way down to Nazca, as we were discussing earlier, and then into Ica. So they were actually quite a big civilization between 800 BC and 100 AD. They covered a lot of territory. And as we saw when we were leaving Lima, Totora reed grows in this area. And with Totora, you can build not only boats, you can build ships. So with an abundance of that material, and the fact that we found in the archaeological record that the Baracus were making things out of sea lion skin and also out of whales, they had to have been navigators. They had to have been masters of the ocean, because in order to chase down a whale, you need speed and you need finesse. So that gives us a possible clue to their ancestry, that they knew how to work the ocean very well. And you can literally build a Totora reed boat as big as you want. You can make it 200 feet long if you wanted. And then also in the archaeological record, we find this, which is called spondula shell. And a lot of artifacts of the royal Baracus were made out of this shell, and it's only found on the coast of Ecuador. So it's unlikely that it made its way by foot from Ecuador down. It's more likely that the Baracus were able to sail north, at least as far as Ecuador, and then turn around and sail back. And what they would take with them as trade goods was copper from Lake Titicaca. So that meant that Baracus were trading with people in the highlands more than 2,000 years ago. They were not just an isolated pocket of people. They also made clothing out of alpaca, which comes from the highlands of Peru. So that shows us also that the ancient Inca road system is much older than the Inca. What the Inca did is they would make improvements to the roads to make them more efficient, but roads such as the one connecting Lake Titicaca with Cusco is probably several thousand years old. And we also have this artifact we're going to see, which is the candelabro. And that's the day after tomorrow in the morning. It's 500 feet tall. This is the beginning of the Nazca system, or so-called Nazca system of geoglyphs. And so different theories have been pronounced as to what it represents. Some people think it represents a cactus, or that during the colonial times, some pirates buried their treasure at the bottom, but that makes it kind of an obvious target from a long way away. Excuse me. You can only see it from the ocean or from a plane. And that's the fallacy partially that ancient aliens were doing. They kept saying you can only see this stuff from a plane. It depends what you're looking at. A lot of the Baracus work is on the sides of mountains, so they could be seen, either from the sea or in some cases from the land, but the Nazca stuff is on the flat. So Senior Juan came up with the brilliant idea that this is actually the mirror image of the Southern Cross star system, or star cluster, because the Southern Cross rises directly behind it. And so if that's the case, then that would be a navigational marker, because throughout Polynesia, the Southern Cross was always used as an indication of where you are, depending upon how high it is in the sky. So that's how Hawaiians could make it easily on a regular basis pre-contact to Tahiti and back because they knew the sky system and how it worked. So that's a clue. And then, okay, so another interesting thing is at different cemeteries we have different shapes of skulls. So here, this is from the Chongo Cemetery where the big ones are found. And again, you see this is vertical elongation. And again, here's this bump thing on the forehead, which probably wouldn't be the result of binding. It's probably a genetic characteristic. And then when we get to another cemetery called Cerro Colorado, you see the shape is slightly different. And I don't know why that is. I think it's probably time periods. Probably the Chongo Cemetery is the oldest with the natural people. Then you have Cerro Colorado with some deformation. And then the last of the Baracus are shaped like this. So it's just a bit of flattening of the forehead and the back of the head. And this represents the end of the Baracus era and the beginning of the Nazca era. And this is, that's a very classic Baracus. You see how complex the shape of the skull is? As compared, this is head binding, and that's different. So I think this is one of the original line of people, and this one also is being DNA tested right now too. We have 15 skulls that are being DNA tested in the US after a process of 3 years negotiating with the Peruvian government, bureaucracy. But we're hoping to do a worldwide press conference December 15th with all the results. I'm working with a man called L.A. Marzulli, who's actually in direct contact with the labs themselves, and I keep bugging him to tell me what they found, and he said, well, it's interesting, but I can't tell you because you'll blab it all over the internet. So that's why we have to wait for the press conference, which unfortunately I would do. So this is a comparison of a normal human skull on the left and the classic Baracus on the right. So you see, that's not the result of head binding. It doesn't, it's not simply a change in shape, it's cranial volume, and you can't make someone's skull grow bigger. It's genetically programmed the plates are genetically programmed to connect. So if you alter the shape, it's like taking a pot on a potter's wheel that's still called greenware, where it's still flexible. You can change the shape of it, but you're not going to alter the internal volume. So in a normal human skull, again, you have these two suture lines, this one across this way and this one going back that way. So that's every living human being that is normal and has ever been Homo sapiens sapiens has that design. Whereas the Baracus are missing the suture. So again, medical professionals can't explain what's going on because there's absolutely no sign of the suture whatsoever. So either it fuses very early on or these people were born without it, and that's not something that is Homo sapiens sapiens. Also, we have these, which are called foramen, and they're located here and there, and their function is that's where blood and nerve flow come out of the skull, because your spinal cord and circulatory system is back here, and so in order to properly feed these areas, that's how evolution created or did that in order to make sure that blood flow and nerve flow were efficient for the skull. And in the back of all of the elongated skulls, there are two foramen. So that probably is the result again of genetics, because the skull was much larger and farther away from the spinal cord, that nature produced that, or some alien planet, in order to be able to circulate blood and nerve flow in the back of the elongated head. Again, these are things that archaeologists don't look at. They just keep the skulls in boxes in a back room, and there's no study. And then also this area too, which is where major muscles connect to your skull to make sure that your skull is easy to move around and is balanced, is much more pronounced. So it's likely because of the larger size of the skull, which is partially wanting to move backwards, that is extra strong, so the muscles are larger in order to be able to keep that balance. And then as well, this is where your spinal column enters, it's called the Foramen Magnum. So that's basically exactly in the center of where your skull is. And again, that's what nature has done to make sure that your head is easy to keep in a balanced position in relation to the rest of the body. But in the Baracus ones, it's way to the back. So again, that's not cranial deformations, that's genetics moving the foramen magnum back to compensate for the fact that the skull wants to move backwards. So again, that's a genetic anomaly. And this is likely the final plight of the royal Baracus people. This is basically a killing field. So we found about 50 cranially deformed skulls here, but they were not ceremonially buried. Baracus tombs tend to be 8 to 20 feet underground, and these are literally almost on the surface. So this is probably a location where the Nazca arrived and wiped out these people. But as I said, word was probably sent somehow because Camacho was to the north, that word got to the other royal people, and they were able to escape on the road and probably made it to Cusco. So here we have the astronaut, and as I said on the bus, the astronaut, even if you ask archaeologists, the astronaut was made by the Baracus culture because it's three-dimensional, slightly, not heavily, but three-dimensional slightly. It's on the side of a mountain, it's not on the flat ground, and it's not simply an outline. It's been scooped out in order to create an almost 3D appearance. So that means that the Baracus were definitely in Nazca at some point in time. And then these are some of the Baracus ones that are found at Palpa. So you see how complicated and bizarre they look, almost like half insect, half human, whereas the later Nazca ones are very simple forms, and that's it. So this probably shows quite a high level of spiritual thought, because you have all these different odd-looking deities or whatever, and there are more than 1,000 locations in the Palpa Valley that have these. A lot of them are on the tops of the mountains, which are very mesa-shaped. And on Ancient Aliens, they did say that there's a mountain in Nazca where somebody came and cut the top of the mountain off. But we had a geologist with us, and she said, no, those were mesas. Millions of years of erosion resulted in flat, mesas, flat tops with angled curved sides. And the largest ceremonial adobe city in the world is located near Nazca. It's called Cahuachi, and it was most likely first inhabited by the Baracus and then later was taken over by the Nazca people. But it is the largest adobe ceremonial site in the world, and only one of 30 to 50 pyramids have been uncovered. If you ever go there, you see the landscape, you see these big hills. They're not hills, they're pyramids, so that's a lot of work. But what they did find at Cahuachi were Baracus skulls that had holes drilled in the forehead, and they're called trophy skulls. So it's quite possible that after the Nazca had wiped out the Baracus, who were very successful agricultural experts, and as the area began to become more and more desert-like, that they used the skulls for divination, to pray to those who had come before, who had the knowledge of how to grow plants, in order to save them. And the Nazca had to abandon the whole Nazca area by 600 AD because they had defoliated the whole area. So the landscape of Nazca now was not the same 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, it was more like African savanna. But they gave themselves a death sentence. And here's a Baracus culture depiction of somewhat of an elongated head that's was in the Baracus Museum. And this is one of the classic Baracus ones with the dark red hair. Again, every elongated skull of the Baracus I've seen has had red hair, and then the normal looking people have black hair. So when archaeologists say, well, it's just the the case of time or something in the sand they were buried in caused the bleaching, experts who have analyzed the hair say, no, this is genetically red, and red hair originates in the Middle East, in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. So that's why we're thinking there may be a genetic connection of the Baracus, or that their homeland may have been in the Middle East at some point. And then because they were seafarers, they were able to, over the course of time, sail through Polynesia, and then they found Easter Island, and then they stopped at Easter Island because red-haired ancient people used to live there before the time of the Polynesians. And then somehow they made it to the coast of Peru, and Baracus is the largest natural bay on the coast of Peru. And so that would be a place where maritime people would want to settle, because your ship is protected from any damage from wind or rough seas. It's always calm. And this is comparing a 1-year-old normal baby with an 18-month-old or 18-month-old Baracus. So you see the difference? And their god, who was called Kon, from which we get Kon-Tiki, is always depicted with red hair. So why would a Native American people come up with that idea? Because all Native American people genetically have black hair. So that's an indication of interesting kind of connection. And there are multiple examples that we find in the Baracus area of red hair. Again, it's not red hair like Celtic carrot top hair. It's a dark auburn. And even blonde ones have been found. So that defies the idea that all the peoples of the Americas crossed the Bering Land Bridge, because we know that's the standard story, but it's not giving ancient people the benefit of the doubt in that maybe they were maritime people. You know, maybe the world was circumnavigated thousands of years before the Vikings. I think probably. So this is just one of the studies done with of the Baracus hair, and it's shown that the hair was 30% thinner than Native American hair, was naturally wavy and red. So those are 3 characteristics distinguishing the Baracus hair from Native Americans. And this is just another study of that too. So what this study says, the evidence indicates that the nature of hair does not alter after death except becoming dry and brittle. The color doesn't change. So in the standard history, this is in terms of genetics what we find. Basically all native people of South America are of 4 different haplogroups, which is your genetic background, A, B, C, and D. And so we can see that A, C, and D are from Siberia, and then B is from the area of Korea or Vietnam. So that's where Native Americans' ancestors come from. But when we started to do the DNA testing of the Baracus, the baby, the only haplogroup they found was U2E1, which is Northern European. And then this one on the right, which is also from the Chongo Cemetery, turned out to be haplogroup T2, which is from the area of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Ukraine. And that's a long way from Siberia. And then this one, which we'll get to see with, again with the red hair, is H1, and H1 is Scandinavian, and partially towards the Caspian and Black Sea. What's this one? Oh, okay. And then the one on the left is H2A, which is basically from the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and possibly into Saudi Arabia as well. And so you can see if you were, you know, that area, the Middle East is as we know, has been constantly under conflict. to this very day. And there are ancient people who still live in Iraq and Iran who are being hunted down by ISIS because they're pre-Islamic people. So they want to wipe out anybody who was there or is there that isn't Muslim. And those people have red hair. This is a drawing of a fetus that was found in the 19th century, I believe in Cusco. And again, you can see the head is the size of the body. Now this specimen is probably located in the warehouses of the Lima Museum, but no one is allowed to see it, along with many others, because it's just too different. And this one was found at a little village called Patapatani in Bolivia at Lake Titicaca. And it's in a small museum there. You see the size of the head compared to the body. And this is Royal Chulpa Tower where it was found, so nobility. And this is a photograph I took of it. Again, you see the sense of scale. And when I was blown away because this is the first time that I saw an actual full skeleton, because normally you'll see a skull or two, but not full skeleton. Irene kept poking me in the back and saying, "Look at the baby." I said, "What?" And so in the case right next to it is this. So you see the size of the head. And fortunately, I had radiologist Ken with me. He hired us to take him to Tiahuanaco because he said that he was a physicist. And I went, well, you'll be fascinated with what you're going to look at. And then at the end of the day, we tried to figure out what to do the next day. And I got Ken to pay to go to Patapatani. And when we got there, he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm also a radiologist." And so when he looked at these two specimens, he and I said nothing for the rest of the day. And the next morning he came in for breakfast and he said, "I'm 90% certain that that was mother and baby, and they both died during childbirth." So that means that baby would have been born with a huge elongated head. So we're hoping to do DNA testing of these two as well. And then this is a video.
And here we have a frontal view. Again, eyes. And you see the red hair. And you see the overall shape of the skull. Now, is this the result of cranial deformation or head binding?
So that's a newborn baby.
Possibly 3 months old. Then that would not be enough time.
Again, you see the red hair.
Normally takes between 6 months and
The size of the eye sockets. So I was allowed to look at that for about 3 hours. And then I had to give it back to the person who had it. And then when we went to him a little bit later to get samples for DNA testing, he said, "Oh, sorry, I sold it last week." So it's in a private collection somewhere. And some of you may have heard of what's called the Starchild Skull that was found in Mexico, 800 years old. There's the Starchild Skull on the right compared to a normal human. That's Lloyd Pye, who was the caretaker for 12 years. And most people think that there's only one Starchild Skull that's been found in the world. And that's what one depiction is of what it looked like. That's a facial reconstruction. And it has 25 physical and chemical characteristics which make it unlikely to be a human being. So that's what you know, if you're looking for aliens, look for actual scientific data rather than it looks weird so it's an alien, but it's physically and chemically it's different. So that makes it a candidate for something that maybe didn't evolve here. But also in the little Baracus Museum, you'll get to see another Starchild Skull, this one. So any medical professional that's looked at that to say, "I don't know what it is," you know, it's not any disease I can think of. And if you notice the shapes of the eye sockets, you know, it looks quite different. And here again, comparing it with the other Starchild skull, we can't see actually where the mandible or the lower jaw actually attaches to it, to the upper, and no evidence of teeth. And that is a depiction by Marcia Moore of what she thinks this looked like. And she's not a big UFO fan or anything. She's an artist, and she simply rebuilds. If I send her a photograph of the skull at different angles, then she tries to rebuild it as to what she thinks it literally looked like. So that's kind of interesting. And then there are two more that were recently discovered in Cusco. So that means there are at least four anomalous skulls that are able to be examined and tested. And this is a banker who lives in Spain. So even to this day, there might be people who have a throwback of this interesting genetic condition. Then we get into some of you may have heard of what are called the Nazca mummies that were recently discovered. And I got to see a few of them in real life, and they are very weird looking. And my background is biology, so I was like, oh my God. But any expert that's actually looked at them seriously believes that they're very clever fakes. Oops. Ah. Oops. So there's a lot of money involved in these right now. And whenever you see lots of money involved, rather than being something authentic, it could be a fabrication. But this could actually be the head of a turtle that's been altered, where the slit's been put in and stuff like that, to make it alien looking. There on the side. And the covering is some kind of vegetable fiber. So it could literally be something like lettuce that's been layered on top of it in order to make it look weird. That's underneath. And then this is I saw this in person. That's a three-fingered hand. And you look at it and you go, oh my God, evidence of alien life. But then when you see the X-ray, you see the bones are not in the proper position. So in this, you're supposed to have almost like a ball and socket joint, going one to the next, like here, that socket ball. But here you have two balls matching up. So this has been fabricated from at least two different people. Again, because there's lots of money involved. And then the so-called Maria skeleton is most likely that one there. That coating is the clay found in this area. So when people say it's a special kind of clay, it's like there are millions of tons of this. That's what gives the Nazca figures and lines the appearance. Because when you scrape away the surface, the clay is underneath, and that's what gives you the contrast. You have volcanic activity on top from exploding ancient volcanoes on top of an ancient seabed. So the seabed is white because it's limestone, powdered limestone, and then the volcanic granite is on top of it. You scrape that away, and that's what gives you the Nazca look. But these are real ones. This is in the museum in Cochabamba. This is the Oruro culture from Lake Titicaca. Again, you see the size of the head compared to the body. Technically, we weren't supposed to take photographs, but it did anyway. And then this one is from another ancient culture in Bolivia. See the blondish red hair with the huge size of the head compared to the body. And this is an Inca, which is interesting, because this was a 3-year-old Inca, and even though it's wrapped up in rope, you can see how big it is, and there is no suture line. So that means the suture disappeared by the age of 3, which is medically impossible for a normal human being. So that could be another example of someone of the Inca line who looked like that. Then we get into the Egyptian ones, and of course we have Akhenaten, who is actually my favorite pharaoh because he was very, as some of you may know, he was very rebellious, and that's what distinguished him. And so when he, as compared to the earlier pharaohs who wanted the sculptors to make, to make them look super strong and, manly, etc., he said, depict me as I am. So the question is, did he actually look like that? Or is that an exaggeration? But the important thing about him was that prior to his time, the pharaohs began to have less and less power, and what was called the Amen priesthood began to have more and more power. And so he was to be born with the given name of Amenhotep, which means, I believe, the devotee of Amen, which means that he was to devote himself to the Amen priesthood, as in giving his power to them. But because he was immersed in the mystery schools of Egypt, by the time he came to power, he changed his name. To Akhenaten, which means the shadow of Aten. And again, it's important to get the original name and meaning. So this is his, this is his bloodline, Amenhotep III, and then down to him, and then the 6 daughters, and maybe Tutankhamun. It's still disputed whether Tutankhamun was actually his son or if he was his nephew, because the royal family of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the 6 daughters were wiped out, just like the Romanov family of Russia. And because Tutankhamun was allowed to stay alive for a certain period of time, he was probably used as a pawn to maintain a certain level of unity while the Amen priesthood retook the power back again. Because one thing that Akhenaten did, we do see depictions, probably intentional, of his daughters with elongated heads. So since the bodies have never been found, did they actually look like this? Or is Akhenaten trying to tell us something about his ancestry? That maybe he came from a type of divine person who physically looked different than what they actually looked like. And this is the symbol of Aten. This is who he devoted himself to. Some people, or most scholars, believe that he created the first monotheistic culture. But in fact, if you study the work of Stephen Mailer and Abdel Hakim Awian, who was his teacher, then you find out that actually this is not, he didn't invent it. He was trying to bring the culture back to the time of the one God. So he wasn't the creator of it. He wanted a renaissance of it. And that's why he called himself, I am the shadow of Aten. Because most people, most archaeologists will tell you that the sun god was called Ra, but that also is not the full story. So that's the symbol of Aten, and that's Stephen on the right and Hakim on the left. And so actually, through their teaching, which comes from the original oral tradition, there are actually 5 stages or 5 names of the sun. So it represents different times of day. It also represents a human life, and it represents a very long time scale too. So the first, at dawn, the sun is called Keper because that's symbolized by the dung beetle pushing the ball, as in the beetle or the scarab is pushing the sun rising up into the sky. And then next we don't have Ra, we have Sa-Ra, which is in a human life depicted as a teenager and also symbolized by the ram because Ra is, or the teenager is very rebellious. And then the next stage is Un, possibly from which we get noon. And then Aten, and this also represents levels of consciousness. So Keper is the lowest level of consciousness, and then Sa-Ra is higher consciousness, Un is even higher consciousness, and then Aten is the highest level of consciousness. Because the final stage of the sun, which is when the sun's going down, is Amen. And so Amen we use in Christianity as meaning thy will be done. But in fact, the original meaning is, let it remain hidden. So that's descending into darkness. So that's why Akhenaten wanted to bring back the early, he was living in the time of Amen because the priests called themselves the Amen priesthood, which meant they knew the secrets, nobody else was to find out. And he was pissed off because he saw with his father and his grandfather a lowering of their ability to make any decisions, because the priests would say, no, we'll take care of it, we'll take care of it. Just sit there, it's okay. So that's why Akhenaten rebelled and said, no, I'm taking power back to me. And that's why they killed him. So again, there's a depiction of him, and many depictions of him with an elongated head for some reason. And this is probably, I think this is called Marfan syndrome, which could have been the disease that he suffered from. So it is possible that he looked kind of androgynous genetically, but others say, just stylistically, he said, I'm a balanced person, so if you want to put feminine characteristics on me in my sculpture, I don't really care, because I'm more interested in thinking and philosophy than I am how you depict me. He was above that. He was a very philosophical person. And so one of the things he did was he moved his capital. It had always been, or for a long time, in Thebes, which is the Karnak-Luxor area. And so he moved it to a site called Amarna, which is also called Akhenaten, which I think means the dawn of Aten, as in dawn as in rebirth. And most people think that it was virgin land that he built on, but that's not true. It's actually an ancient megalithic site, so he knew about that too. He knew there was a dynastic time period where people had technology and were able to do incredible things. So this is what the city looked like. It's built very fast and very lush, right next to the Nile, and very beautiful structures. And here again, some of the fragments found. The reason why all of the artifacts from Akhenaten's time period are damaged is the Amen priesthood destroyed everything. There is no intact sculpture that comes from that time. They wanted him eradicated from history, including if you go to one of the temples in Egypt, they have the complete line of all of the pharaohs with him missing. So they wanted him erased. And the art form that he allowed to evolve was much more naturalistic. So again, it was this Renaissance time period where he said, stop with the stick figures and stuff, and stop with any depictions of half human, half animal head stuff. That's your Amen stuff. That's you with your 1,000 gods. I'm going back to the one, because there is only one creator of the universe. We've known that for a long time. So the art was allowed to flourish during his time, but you see that one, the left-hand side's broken. And most of his artwork was buried. And his nose and that of Nefertiti's were broken off. And again, a very natural kind of look compared to what preceded. And that's what Amarna looks like now. It's just a wasteland. There's nothing there. The Amen priesthood destroyed every single stone to eradicate any knowledge of the existence. So there's, again, everything's broken, smashed to pieces. These are all that's left, and these are made of fiberglass. I thought, oh, good, great artifact score. Boom, boom, oops. So, and actually, this is Stephen Mailer. That is where winter solstice occurs. So that's why he named it that, and that's why he put it in that location, because he wanted to see the dawn of the sun at winter equinox come right in that cleft. So it was very carefully chosen. He had knowledge of this ancient place. That's what's left of his sarcophagus, supposedly. Just these dark parts are the original. All the rest of it is concrete and mixed up with other materials. And then when we go above the plain area of Akhenaten and enter into these chambers, you can see the interior space here was all carved out. And so it's very unlikely that this was done during his time period, because it would take a hell of a lot of effort to be able to shape up these massive chambers, some of which are 2 and 3 stories going down. So it's more likely that he discovered this or knew knowledge of this ancient site that was likely built during the time of Aten, which would be somewhere in the region of 10,000 years ago, or much old, twice as old as the dynastic period. And that's just another small area inside one of these chambers. And then a staircase going down. This is a 3-level construction inside the side of the mountain. And there he is. That's one of the few depictions of him that doesn't show a lot of damage. So you can see he's depicting himself with a rather fancy kind of headgear of some kind. And most archaeologists interpret that as being that's the headdress worn for warfare. But we found out from local people that it actually means a person of high wisdom or a person of high consciousness would wear that. So maybe that's a reflection of those that came before. And there he is with Aten. And in this case, Nefertiti shown with an elongated head. And there again. And another of the family with the girls having obviously elongated heads. And again, this is Mary Totten. That's in the Cairo Museum. And another depiction of her or one of her sisters. And another. So I think what happened is, I think it's all based on Osiris. I think he was claiming his ancestry from the gods. And Osiris is very often shown to have an elongated head. So I think that's his connection. He's saying, I come from this source. And so you can depict me as that because that's not what I look like, but that's where I come from originally. And for some reason, Osiris usually has green or blue skin, so that hints at maybe he came from another planet. Maybe Sirius. This is supposedly his skull, but Zahi Hawass, who you may have heard of, is notorious for making amazing discoveries just at the right time. So when 5 or 10 years would go by and no major discoveries were found, then he would suddenly claim, we found Akhenaten, and then we found Nefertiti. And it's very unlikely that he found either of them, because if the Alman priesthood probably believed that he, again, was trying to draw his bloodline from Osiris, who was cut into 42 pieces by his brother Set. So that probably was the fate of Akhenaten. Not just kill him and deface him, but you chop his body up and strew the pieces in different directions so he can never come back or go anywhere. And that supposedly is Nefertiti, but has not been genetically proven. And then we have Tutankhamun, who actually does have an elongated head, but it's slightly elongated in the back, and then there's a depression in the top of his head. So that's probably what he looked like. Not the really exaggerated forms in the art, but there is some kind of genetic variation going on. And that is believed what he looked like. He may have actually suffered from the same disease as his father/uncle. And the interesting thing about the tomb, his tomb, is that if you see the original photographs, you'll see that things were not put in a really nice order. It looks like stuff was like shoved in there and it was sealed off. And again, people in the know, like Stephen, who studied Akhenaten for 50 years, believes that actually when Akhenaten and the royal family were murdered, those that devoted themselves to them very quickly took all of the sacred art they could find in Akhenaten and then moved it to the Valley of the Kings, and then opened up a tomb and put it in there and sealed it off before the Ahmed priesthood could grab it all and destroy it. So it could very well be that that is not simply the stuff that was made for for Tutankhamun during his life, but it was actually the hereditary artifacts of the whole family. But since a lot of them would have the names of the Amarna family on them, then obviously what the Amun priesthood wanted to do is destroy all of it because they didn't want the name to be known ever again. And also some believe that this was not Tutankhamun's funerary mask, but that it was made for Nefertiti. And again, since it was for her, you know, that's a lot of workmanship. Yeah, a lot of gold. Tutankhamun gets ill, dies, and then all of a sudden they're cranking all this stuff out.